for choosing to spend an hour of your Thursday evening in this way as well. I'm the public historian at Westminster Abbey. It's a new role for me. I've just begun in January. Previously, I managed two interpretation projects at St. Paul's Cathedral in collaboration with community groups, which produced two trails about monuments that are connected with the East India Company and also the wars in the Caribbean. I also teach on the history of Christianity at Westcott House, Cambridge. And so although my area of academic expertise is actually in early medieval monasticism, I have found myself increasingly pulled into the direction of heritage and public history in recent years because of some questions that I wanted to solve, at first for my own sake, about how I relate to my Western Christian heritage, and also, to be quite frank, how I kind of reconcile the fact that I have rather Anglophile interests and tastes, how I deal with these dilemmas as a person of diasporic background. I spent my formative years of my life in two former colonies. So I was born in Hong Kong. I spent my early childhood years there. And so Hong Kong, some of you will know, is considered by many to have been the last British colony. And then I was also raised in Canada, which is conversely one of the earliest British colonies. And then my entire life as a mother of three children has then been spent here in the UK, and we've been British nationals for a long time. So questions of heritage as they relate to churches and my Christian faith and colonial legacies, they've all become very important to me. And because of all these questions I had, I wrote a book to work through them, and then that led me deeper and deeper into the heritage sector. And now I sit on several historic conservation bodies in the Church of England, including the Cathedral's Fabric Commission for England and the Church Buildings Council's Contested Heritage Committee. I hope that's sufficient.
That's fantastic. Thank you very, very much. And it would be a delight now to hear from Olivia, whatever you would like to share with us by way of introduction.
Thank you, Ayla. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and with everyone at home. So I have a background as an architectural historian. Originally, I suppose, an academic background in terms of my education and PhD. The PhD that I undertook was about the perceptions of medieval buildings during the early modern period. So I sort of began as a medievalist and then found myself creeping into Gothic revival and then back again into the early origins of the Gothic revival, which essentially led me back to becoming an early modernist. So I suppose the play between past and present is always something that motivates me, that has driven my personal interests and my research interests. Having, I suppose, begun in an academic arena, I then wanted to find a way to apply that research in a way that would make a difference in contemporary life. And so I became an architectural investigator for English heritage. And in that role, I carried out research that was then used to inform the management of listed buildings and also the designation of new listed buildings. I found myself missing working with a collection, although in a way, the buildings that we have around us are a national collection of architecture. But I found myself drawn back into working with drawings and objects. And so I became the Senior Curator of Architecture and Design at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And in that role, I looked after the collection of architectural drawings, which was part of the Designs collection. And that is an amazing repository of knowledge, of documentation about the built environment, which is used by a variety of different researchers and creative people as well. So again, sort of bringing together sort of public and theoretical ideas. And then having had a decade at the Victorian Albert Museum at the beginning of this year, like Renie taking over a new job, in January, I became the chief curator of the RIBA collections. So that's effectively, in a way, that it's the de facto national collection of architecture, architectural drawings, models, portraits, and archives. And including drawings by Wren and his school. And I suppose also in terms of the relevance for this discussion as well, I am a practicing Christian. And so church architecture has always been something that has been very familiar to me, but that I've never wanted to take for granted. I mean, I feel when I walk into a church, I feel immediately at home, because of its nature as, you know, the temple. But trying to understand that and unpack it is something that I've always been very interested in. I also, like many, sit on the Westminster Abbey Fabric Commission. And full disclosure, I'm the wife of a vicar, so I have another sort of side of experiencing parish life, and chaplaincy work as well. So I hope that gives a sense of the perspectives that I might bring to bear.
Thank you. And one of the things that I've really noticed about both your introductions is the way in which you've woven together your holistic vocations, I suppose, your professional expertise and the layers of your background that you bring to your roles and your perspectives now, especially speaking in rooms where many listen, as we say sometimes at St. James's, not necessarily because we find ourselves in rooms where many people listen, but because that's a measure sometimes of influence, of being able to speak and to share and to offer one's work for good as much as possible, however good with a capital G or a small g may be defined in all kinds of different moments, especially in relation to architecture and art that is the product of deep held belief. If we say in one way or another that these things and these spaces have been made and have been places of deep change and transformation in people's lives across the generations, if we say that those things and those spaces are connected with the glory of God, then I'm always curious about what we really mean by that, whether in 2025 or for Christopher Wren in 1684. I am really, really glad to see that, as far as I can tell, Elsie Owusu, our third speaker, has entered the room. And yes, excellent, fantastic. Elsie, it's really good to see you. And thank you for your time and for joining us here. We have just had some introductions from Renie and Olivia. And so if you would like to share yours as well, a couple of minutes about how you would like to introduce yourself, your background, and your expertise this evening.
I'm not sure I'm going to go on for a couple of minutes, but I'll try. I'm an architect, conservation architect, and I was born in Ghana in West Africa, and I have lived in the UK since I was 9. And I'm an architect in private practice. I've done the work that I've done has mostly been around, well, it started off with social housing, which I was very interested in, and community engagement. And later on, I started my own practice with a similar focus. Then I went on to work for an ancient practice called Field and Wilson, which started off in Norwich, was one of the original conservation practices, for which I led on the UK Supreme Court and on Green Park Station, two diametrically opposite, you might say. And I heard the end of the introduction. So my real interest in church buildings is really as very, very big buildings and particularly the buildings, the church buildings that were, I suppose, started medieval churches. I'm particularly interested in how people made such big and complex buildings without the benefit of, before electricity was a twinkle in anybody's eye, and the technology of scaffold, and looking at a building like Notre Dame in Paris, for instance, which has the main building goes up well over 30 meters, and that was done just that those buildings were made just through human ingenuity and determination. So that to me is really, the power of the human spirit to create extraordinary things, to make extraordinary things, I find endlessly fascinating. And I still can't really comprehend how St. Paul's, for instance, the old St. Paul's, but certainly the new St. Paul's, came about with such precision and such skill and such beauty, when people were working essentially hand over hand. And it's quite amusing that nowadays we struggle over making homes for people, when we do have access to such wealth and such technology and such resource. So a never-ending interest and conundrum for me, architecture is, and just the fact that it's a team sport. Buildings get credited to one individual, but they never are the result of individual effort. They are always
Thank you.
A shared enterprise.
And the way in which community and its beliefs is expressed through its architectural endeavors, and the way that that relates to even things like technology, or the specific choices that people are making around what we might now call teamwork, or aspects of leadership, that all of those things are social as well as fabric infrastructure, if I can put it like that. And so in the room as well, we represent together a number of different nations, a number of approaches. Olivia, you're married to a vicar. I happen to kind of be one, I guess. So I hear from my husband regularly what being a priest spouse is like, and the two of them and the two of us could spend some time together talking about that. But I'm also very aware, Elsie, and what you've shared, that the Supreme Court, in the life that building had before, as well as Middlesex Guildhall, it's across the street from Westminster Abbey, where Olivia and Renie regularly encounter one another. And the relationship between public life and government, and these buildings as symbols of values, whether that's still true or not, whether they're being transformed day by day through who is seeing them and through which lenses and where and why. The same is true, absolutely, for St. James's Piccadilly and for every church. The layers of history are always, I think, high stakes, as well as abiding at the intersections of the human and the divine. They remind us of our limitations, as well as reminding us of what is possible. Imagination is at the heart of this, as well as things like capacity. How many projects are we all familiar with, past and present, where the end of the story, or at least just before the ellipsis, is, and then they ran out of money. That happens all the time. So thinking about limitations and resources in relation to the human spirit, both theologically and beyond, is where I think in part this conversation can go this evening. Olivia, I'd like to start with you, especially because Elsie just mentioned St. Paul's as this extraordinary feat, hand over hand, as you put it. And so, Olivia, as an expert in early modern British architecture, and Christopher Wren, what do you think of Wren's unique use of light? The relationship between, I guess, sculpture and space and light. And Wren had real serious beliefs about light and geometry. And what they meant as well as how they could be used. So please do share about that if you wish.
He certainly did. And I think one of the fascinating things about Wren is that he was so considered in what he did. And you talked about architecture as the product of belief. And for Wren, architecture was the product of his was really the product, I suppose, of his interest in science. So originally he has been a scientist. He was a professor in Oxford, and so his ideas about architecture, I suppose, have that considered intellectual basis. But because he was practicing at a time of the rise of the empiricism and the practical generation of knowledge. His ideas are also very much rooted in practicality. And obviously the feat of St. Paul's, which dominated the majority of his life, is balanced against those smaller projects, significant projects, such as St. James's. And it's interesting, I think there's one, we're very lucky that we have his advice on church building, the letter that he wrote in 1711, looking back on, in a way, it's a distillation of his advice about how to build a good church, and how to build a good church in an urban setting. And one of the reasons it interests me is because it's not about producing the one-off like St. Paul's. So St. Paul's was absolutely extraordinary. It was before the Great Fire of London. He had been looking at St. Paul's, thinking that it needed to be reworked because it was falling down. The medieval church was falling down. And Inigo Jones had a go at it and cloaked it in a sort of classicizing case and built the West Portico and so forth. But everybody knew that St. Paul's was crumbling and needed to be overhauled. But that was something which then, after the fire, it was a unique opportunity. Whereas the opportunity to create smaller churches in an expanding urban fabric was something that would come along more often. And so he talked about, first and foremost, not even just the interior of the church, but its relationship to the urban fabric. And obviously that's how we experience a church as well. We approach it along the street. He advised that churches should be built in the centre of town, that churches should be placed on the larger thoroughfares. So he talked about them being brought forward, which I like, this sort of sense that they're entering into the urban space in a very sort of active way, and that they should be positioned on open streets, not in obscure lanes, as he described it. So that these should be, you should fall over a church, right? It shouldn't be hidden away. It should have a presence, and it should provide a welcome as well. So he talked about how a church should have a portico because they are beautiful and they're also convenient. They're useful. If you can shelter under them, you know where to enter the church. If you see a portico, it's an invitation. And he also talked about spires, so that the spires of churches would provide an ornament to any urban centre. And then he also talked about how there should be a plainness and sort of practicality in the way that a church was built. And anyway, I think it's that plainness which now we see as tremendously beautiful as well, that there's a pared down quality to it, as well as these extravagant moments of decoration through interior carving and so forth. And partly that plainness was about making sure that something was fit for purpose, because for Wren, the beauty of something came not just, and in fact, maybe not principally from ornament, but from something being useful and performing its function to the best of its capacity. So he was interested in the use of brick because it was strong, the use of the judicious use of stone appropriately for door cases and for windows to add emphasis to those parts of the building. So there's a kind of sense of decorum about how a building should behave, and therefore also how a building makes the people behave who are within it and who encounter it. Marble, he said, was too costly. You could maybe have it behind an altarpiece. So there's this great sort of practicality, and he even talks about how the roofs should be made of oak because it's durable, and actually that's useful because the church wardens might forget about checking on the soundness of the roof.
Then
So
would probably have been horrified that the spire now at St. James's, because of what happened to it, it was really destructively bombed in 1940. And so the solution that they found for the spire with Albert Richardson, who's this early to mid 20th century architect, following in the footsteps of Wren with his own kind of pared back, stripped down, and also quite inventive and sometimes quite eccentric classicism, it's fiberglass up there. And so I suspect Christopher Wren would have been like, what a remarkable new technology. And he also would have been like, what in the world are you doing? You know, it could have been both.
He absolutely would have embraced new technology. I mean, he was very much interested. He liked brick because it was Roman, and he, in his excavations around London, had found Roman brick. So he liked that because it showed how long something lasted. But I think
funny you should say that, because in the opening of the South Door, I was standing there with Ptolemy, the architect, and we were looking at the bricks as almost historical layers. And Renie, I'm going to come to you next in a moment to think about the historical layers of people's stories and how they kind of interact through generations with one another. And so here's the image of the brick, which Olivia has so brilliantly brought to mind by thinking about Wren and materials and things being fit for purpose, simple as well as perhaps even elegant and resonant in the stories they tell. Ptolemy thinks that the bricks at the lower level, right next to the soil, when they sort of took it all out and figured out where they were going to put in this new Portland stone afresh, he thinks that some of them are maybe even 16th century. And he looked at it and he said, I wonder whether or not this is Tudor. Bricks are being reused all the time, and lots of materials are being reused all the time. And that's a classic thing going back many, many, many centuries, spoliation, right? Where you have a whole bunch of stuff from a building and then it becomes useful as a resource for your new thing, whatever it is.
Like you've got a ready-made quarry, effectively, of whatever
exactly.
you need. Your supply is there.
So every brick was new once, and
but also
every story. Go ahead.
At that point in time, I think, after the fire, there was such a great, the Great Rebuilding, there was such a demand for bricks, that bricks were being made to lower quality. And Wren was very concerned that, in fact, the older bricks were better quality, that they would be more durable, because the modern bricks were being baked too quickly and being made of substandard ingredients. And so it may also have been a preference for reusing bricks because actually they would be more durable.
That has some interesting things to say in our own time as well about reuse and sustainability and durability of materials. Renie, I would love to ask, especially because in your introduction, you mentioned that you come from this layered background and chose to do some writing about that, and how heritage and sacred space and meaning are really enfolded in and around your practice, and as well as your academic expertise. And so in your work and writing, what have you found to be most significant about the relationship between heritage and belonging?
Yeah, I love this question. I think the question is so fantastic, because the fact that questions of belonging are even permitted, or even just basically seen as relevant in the heritage industry, is what makes this sector just the most exciting for me. I mean, my background in the academic discipline of history, it doesn't really allow for questions of personal sense of belonging. And so it was just a most liberating moment for me, actually, when I discovered that there was such a field as heritage, and that actually these questions are front and center. And I think this is its greatest power. The most significant thing about the relationship about heritage and belonging to me is that heritage isn't a zero-sum game. So it can always be defined variously in terms of significance to different people or different groups of people in different nations. And it really has the capacity to hold an infinite number of stories about why individuals and groups from all different backgrounds, who otherwise actually might not have anything to do with one another, why they have a stake or an interest in the same heritage asset. So, you know, why they find meaning or significance or value in a specific cultural asset. So heritage really has the power to create these unexpected connections between people. And I think the task is really for us to be brave enough to try to expose these connections. Actually, I was looking for the perfect metaphor to describe what I'm saying and really struggling. And you've just provided it for me in the metaphor of the brick or archaeology. I feared that it might be too confusing in a conversation about ecclesiastical heritage to then use a metaphor about archaeology. But actually, this is really what I want to say, that we have a chance to uncover the ways that people connect to a heritage asset that actually transcend divisions of race and nationality and religion and perspective if you are bold enough and brave enough to do the research. And I think what's really fascinating is that this is true, or perhaps it's even especially true in the case of contested heritage. And Elsie, well, actually, all of our conversation right now has been about so far St. Paul's Cathedral, but Elsie mentioned her interest in St. Paul's as well. And St. Paul's, I mean, I have just finished leading the curation of the digital trails done in collaboration with community groups there on the East India Company monuments, which commemorate military officers in that cathedral. And so it's interesting to ask whose heritage is this? So the monuments, I mean, to East India Company officers in St. Paul's Cathedral. So obviously it's the heritage of British people. These are monuments about a crown chartered company and its immense commercial and military successes. It's also the heritage of Anglicans specifically, of Christians generally, which is why my interest in St. Paul's in the first place as a place of worship. And actually, in fact, many of the campaigns commemorated in the memorials were the campaigns that made the expansion and spread of Christianity possible in the first place. Elsie's mentioned for her, it's architectural heritage. It's also military heritage. It's the heritage of regimental armies and the armed forces. And then also it's the heritage of people from so many different countries affected by British imperialism. And I think this is what's most powerful about heritage. I mean, the first time I saw a monument at St. Paul's commemorating a key official who was involved in the Opium Wars between Britain and China, I was absolutely astounded. I mean, yes, it was disturbing and even distressing to see it in a cathedral. But to be perfectly honest, my first reaction wasn't necessarily of repulsion immediately, but there was a sense of, wow, there's something to do with the history of my ancestors in this place. And many of the people in the community groups I worked with had very similar reactions that initially, we can't believe there is something to do with us in this place, even if the memorials and the histories that they contain are distressing. But factually, there's a lot to do with the history of, say, the Punjab or Afghanistan or Nepal or Bangladesh or Pakistan in St. Paul's Cathedral. Even within, you know, this bastion of Englishness, and that's so deeply symbolic of establishment power. There's this possibility of finding something that is relevant personally to you. So I think, you know, to answer your question, our histories, as you say, are so deeply interconnected. And so while heritage, we can uncover how heritage actually belongs to so many different people, although some voices have historically been louder in defining it, and others need encouragement or opportunity to expose these ways of interconnection more visibly.
Thank you. And that really resonates with me in a way that I wasn't expecting, as you were sharing just now about your encounter with that memorial and your kind of surprise of, oh, I've just realized, which is pathetic. I've lived in the UK for like 23 years almost now. And I just realized how I feel in my body every time I see a Canadian thing in a public place, particularly in a church or a cathedral. And it almost doesn't matter who it is or what they did or how repulsive or how exciting or how limiting the words are. I think, oh, Canada, that's me, in a way which then really troubles me almost immediately. So it's a very interesting kind of adventure into complicated colonial settler family territory for me as well. So thank you for raising that to the surface. Elsie, I'm going to come to you next, particularly because you and I had this conversation in St. James's Piccadilly a little while ago. And as a Royal Academician, you are one of our many neighbors as a practitioner in architecture. And I was delighted and really honored that you wanted to come and talk in particular about monuments and memorials, about heritage and communities, and in particular about Kwabna Ottaba Kugwano, who was baptized at St. James's just over 250 years ago. We spent some time with the two-part memorial monument honoring of Kugwano in the church together. One part is Che Lovelace's 4 paintings in the narthex, and the other is a memorial that was carved and produced by Cardozo Kindersley. And I would love to see what your perspectives were on that and to see what your views are since that conversation, and maybe whether or not you can see anything kind of intersecting or tying into the dialogue that we are opening out this evening.
I think both of you are muted.
So you're totally right. Two mute people trying to speak to each other. Elsie, I'm sorry. If you can unmute yourself, that would be fantastic. Renie, thank you for saving me from myself as host. That's excellent. Oh, we still can't hear you. So Elsie, if you're able to unmute yourself, that would be great. I cannot do it from here, unfortunately. And I know that you have some fantastically interesting things to say.
There we go.
So I hope we get it. Yes,
gotcha.
Excellent, fantastic.
All right, thank you. So yeah, I think what I was saying was I was just touched by the comments you made about meeting yourself in buildings, and that Renie was saying and you were saying, Ayla. So I was elected to the Royal Academy last year, and around about the same time, I found out about Kugwano. I can't remember exactly where I met him first. I think, oh, I know. I think I was reading about Richard and Mariah Cosway, because he lived in their house. He was a servant to them, and I thought I recognised his name, Kwabna, which means born on Tuesday, and almost all boys in Ghana born on Tuesday are called Kwabna. My brother's called Kwabna, but it was spelled in a peculiar way with a Q rather than a K. So when you pronounced it, if you read it, you wouldn't know, but once you pronounced it, you suddenly realized, oh, he's a Kwabna. Oh, right, okay. So there was and just reading back about his life. So there was a 13-year-old boy who was born in Ajumakun, which is a place I happen to know because we're working there. And he was called Kwabna, and he was kidnapped. He was kidnapped at the age of 13. And the thing about the slave trade is that when the trade becomes a person in the form of a young boy who happened to be playing out in the field with his friends, and is kidnapped and taken, well, I think he was first taken to West Indies, and he describes that journey and the suffering on that journey and the attempts that they tried to make to take the ship over at the risk of their own lives. I mean, it's just an extraordinary story. And then the fact that he became very quickly, he was baptized as John Stewart and then wrote this amazing book about the evils of slavery. Died when he was 33 or 34. So within those 20 years from being kidnapped, he'd done this extraordinary journey, both in life and literature. And he was part of that community around St. James and the Royal Academy, Richard and Maria Cosway, Joshua Reynolds, the abolitionists. And that church, the church, St. James's, was just so central to their mission. And you could sort of almost join their community. And little stories about a young slave girl, a 9-year-old girl who tried to get herself baptized, but was caught and beaten by her owner. And just knowing that he came from Ajumakun, knowing Ajumakun as I do, and thinking that there might be another 13-year-old boy who was as bright and as brilliant as he was, who has a life and is being allowed to grow into his life and his talents in the way that, I mean, he achieved an extraordinary amount, Kugwano, but within 20 years. And you kind of think, well, supposing he'd lived to 60 or 70 or 80 and had continued to be part of that community, that church community, what else might he have achieved? There was just that one book, an amazing book. So just being in the church and just thinking, that sense of, well, he was here once, he was baptized here, and he came to services on Sunday, and he was part of that community, brought the story of enslavement of people to life in a way that I hadn't really realized before. So yes, and then talking to you about it and looking at those images, and particularly the font where he was baptized, it's just an extraordinary experience. So thank you.
That the font is still there.
Yeah.
And that the space that Kugwano and many people would have known is still the kind of, even that it's the shape that it still is, has an extraordinary quality of resonance across generations. At least for me, every day I step into it. And I was at the altar presiding at communion this afternoon, and there were 10 people standing in the church, scattered around. And every time I look out at those light-bathed empty pews, I look around at the monuments and the memorials. At the moment, I look at the strange little temporary plywood hut that's a little space for the workers to keep their tools as they're continuing the South Door project. And I think of a particular line of scripture. And the line I've got again and again is from the 12th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews. And it's, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. I think about that all the time. I think about what the people that we don't know, that we will never meet, those who will come after us. And recently, there was a colleague of mine, a friend who is a priest at our partner church in New York City, St. Bart's. And Meredith came to visit St. James's a few months ago. And so in the recent elections and the political upheaval in the United States, I wrote to her after that visit. And I said, how are you? How are you in your church, in your place, in your time, with the stories and the memories of the generations who have come before and those who are there now and those who will come after? And she said, we are discerning what work is ours to do, and we will do it. And I appreciate so much the work that the three of you do, which I think is a constant discernment for each of us. What is ours to do and how shall we do it, knowing that we do not do it on our own. You may have noticed as well that all of us are women, that we share things in common across architecture and creativity and sacred spaces and spaces of many kinds. And the next conversation next Thursday is also with three people who are women who are eminent and experts in their fields. It's as though I thought about it. It's as though I kind of thought, oh, maybe that's something that also is part of the fabric, no matter how that presents itself for each of you, for each of us, that we share and that we navigate in different ways daily. And so with all of these things layered in conversations that we have started this evening, sharing what you know, what you think, what you feel, what you imagine. What I'm going to do now, before handing it over for some Q&A and some interaction with our audience this evening, is to ask each of you, if I can, for just a very brief word, a response that could be a phrase, one sentence, even just one word, where when you think of what a church is for, the purpose, the deep purpose of a church. What is a church for? What comes to mind? A sentence, a phrase, a word? I am going to pick on one of you first, so I'm going to take a deep, long, slow breath. Olivia, what do you think?
I'm going to return to Wren because he is part of this conversation too. I want to make sure that he is with us here, the only man who's allowed to speak in this moment right now.
Well, and Kuguano too. We do
And
have
Kugwana too.
two
We've done
men
well.
in the room.
So one of the things we were talking earlier about light and space, and I didn't quite get round to talking about, you know, the importance of for Wren of light, because of people being able to see within a church, and people being able to see the preacher, to listen to the word of God. And Wren said that what the aim of his church design was to create auditories. And so I think listening, the church is a place for listening to lots of different voices, to the voices of the congregation that we gather together, to the voice of God, to the voice of different people from history within one place. So actually, I think although Wren meant it in a very practical way of being able to hear the preacher and being able to see what was going on. I think actually listening, an auditory, is a really powerful metaphor for the potential of a place of worship as well.
You listening, and which is sometimes so profoundly challenging. To really listen is sometimes a radical act. Renie.
Sorry, your question was, what is a church for? What is the deep purpose? Okay.
What's a church for?
Yes, well, it's a place where faith is expressed, isn't it? It's for expressing your faith. And I think I don't necessarily mean here the things that might tend to divide Christians, like doctrines or worship styles, you know, whether you prefer guitar or organ. But I think I mean something like it's the place where you express faith in faith, that there is something worthwhile in God, and pursuing him, and all that he um, represents, which is worth believing in. And the second part to that is, I think churches are a place where we are meant to make good on the faith of our ancestors, or those who have brought us to this faith. So I mean, I often think of my parents who converted to Christianity by missionaries from England when Hong Kong was still a British colony. And I think about what made them turn to the faith. And I think the churches here in England, one of the best things that we need to do, and perhaps the most pressing thing to do, is to make good on their faith, when, you know, the fact that they found something worthwhile in Christianity to turn to at the expense of traditional forms of worship. So to acknowledge their commitment, of the commitment of our forebearers, their belief, their service in the name of faith, their sacrifices for the sake of faith. It's a place where we need to make good on these things.
Oh, thank you. Elsie.
I think for me, churches are places where I was going to say generosity. Yeah, I think generosity is a good word. Generosity and the power of human spirit are demonstrated. So what I really love about St. James's Piccadilly is that generosity that Wren had. I mean, you know, in that sense of, I always think of him as a modernist architect, one of the first of the modernist architects, the Baroque being a modern idiom, because he's not heroic in the sense that a lot of architects do attempt to be. He leaves space for grinning gibbons and light and you know, superb bits of art. And to me, he is I suppose the quintessence of the architect as an enabler for other people, for other skills, and for other people's talents. And I really, really appreciate that about him. And I think that comes through particularly in the light that the way the light enters his churches. And I also think he's just got a fabulous sense of humor, in the sense that the St. Paul's that we see now isn't the St. Paul's that was signed off by the committee. He just built a different church and then took the scaffold down and sort of did a ta-da, what are you going to do about it? And I just love that sense of defiance. And yeah, so generosity and the power of human spirit.
Thank you. At the end of our readings, when we gather together as a congregation for services at St. James's, the line that we use, the offering that we use, is listen for what the Spirit is saying. And the congregation responds, thanks be to God. And so that this is an opportunity for listening and for responding to faith and its many expressions, past and present, and for meditating upon generosity, the generosity of architecture and the generosity of the human spirit at its best. I am grateful to each of you for what you've chosen to share and how you've responded to these questions that I've offered in the spirit of St. James's Piccadilly as best we can. And this South Door thing that's gonna happen, all shall be revealed in the next few weeks. It is now for the audience to offer your questions and reflections, and I'm going to stop recording.